The rhythm of the floor polisher hummed in my bones, but it was the jagged fire in my hip that dictated my pace. Every step across the vast marble foyer of the Jang estate was a calculated lie. I leaned heavily on the mop handle, my muscles screaming as I hunched over the bucket, the cold moonlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows to cast long, skeletal shadows over the obsidian floors. The metallic tang of old copper sat heavy on my breath. I'd bitten my cheek raw an hour ago when Marcus threw the chair. A silent scream caught behind my teeth. I adjusted the stiff collar of my black uniform, pulling it higher to hide the handprint blooming like a dark, bruised orchid against my skin. It wasn't just the pain that felt heavy. It was the exhaustion of being a ghost, a shadow meant to clean up the messes of a man who ruled an empire, while I couldn't even clean up the wreckage of my own life. The air in the grand hall smelled of expensive sandalwood and floor wax, a scent that defined the distance between us. Sukin's world was one of crystalline silence and absolute order, a stark contrast to the shouting matches and the smell of stale beer in the apartment I shared with a man who claimed to love me. My hands trembled as I wrung out the cloth, partly from the tremor in my nerves and partly from the hypervigilance that had become my heartbeat. In this house, silence was safety. I had spent 6 months perfecting the art of being part of the furniture, blending into the dark wood paneling and the velvet curtains like a stain that had been successfully scrubbed away. Then the heavy thud of the front doors echoed. The sound of bespoke leather soles against marble. Precise, rhythmic, and terrifyingly familiar. Mr. Jang always returned at 2 a.m. His life governed by a clockwork discipline. I had learned to read the state of the city's underworld just by the weight of his stride. Tonight his footsteps were slower, heavier, purposeful. "You're working late, Nadine." His voice was a low, resonant baritone, the sound of silk over a blade. I didn't look up immediately, fixing a professional, empty expression on my face, even as the movement pulled at the split in my lip where Marcus's ring had caught me. "The foyer needed a deep polish, Mr. Jang," I replied, my voice steadier than the fluttering in my chest. "Your tea is waiting in the study, and the files from the Busan shipment are on your blotter." He didn't move toward the study. He stopped beside me, the scent of his sandalwood cologne wrapping around me like a shield. For a moment, I felt a strange, illogical sense of safety, even though I knew he was the most dangerous man in Seoul. When I finally dared to meet his gaze, his dark eyes weren't looking at the floor. They were locked on where my sleeve had slipped just an inch too high. There was a sharpness in his eyes today, not the coldness of a boss, but the focused, lethal intensity of a hunter who had just found a scent. "You're limping," he said, the words quiet but carrying the weight of a death sentence. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation against whoever had dared to break his silence. The stillness of the estate was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. I kept my head down, focusing the entirety of my willpower on the rhythmic push and pull of the mop, but the precision of the house seemed to mock me. Every time my weight shifted onto my left leg, a sharp, white-hot needle of pain shot from my hip down to my ankle, dragging a jagged, uneven sound across the pristine marble. A drag. In the cathedral-like silence of the foyer, the sound of my limp was as loud as a gunshot. I could feel his eyes. Jang Suk-in didn't watch like a normal employer. He observed like a predator tracking a shift in the wind. He sat behind the massive obsidian desk in the adjacent study, the door left open just enough for the golden light of his desk lamp to spill across the dark hallway. He hadn't turned a page of his ledger in 10 minutes. The scratching of his fountain pen had ceased the moment I entered his line of sight, replaced by a silence so absolute it made my skin crawl. I reached for the bucket, my fingers white-knuckled against the plastic handle. As I leaned over, the fabric of my uniform sleeve caught on the edge of the wringer, tugging upward. Froze. The dark, mottled bruising, a constellation of purples and sickly greens left by Marcus's grip, seemed to glow under the moonlight. I quickly jerked the fabric down, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but the damage was done. The air in the room suddenly felt thinner, colder. I tried to move away, to retreat back into the shadows of the servants' corridor where I belonged, but my leg betrayed me. A sudden cramp seized my thigh, and I stumbled, the mop clattering loudly against the baseboard. The sound echoed up into the vaulted ceiling, a clumsy, broken note in his perfect symphony of order. I braced myself for a reprimand, for the cold dismissal of a man who demanded excellence. I waited for him to tell me I was slow, that I was failing. But the silence that followed was different now. It wasn't the silence of a businessman annoyed by a distraction. It was the heavy, ionized hush that precedes a lightning strike. Behind me, I heard the soft creak of his executive chair. Then the slow, deliberate click of his leather shoes against the floor. He wasn't rushing. He was stalking. I didn't look back, I couldn't. I just stared at the marble, watching his long, dark shadow stretch across the floor until it completely swallowed my own. The scent of sandalwood and cold rain enveloped me, and for the first time, I realized that my invisibility hadn't been a shield at all. It had only been a delay. He had noticed the flaw in his world, and he was coming to claim it. The heavy, rhythmic click of his shoes stopped directly behind me, the sound final and absolute. I kept my gaze fixed on the floor, tracing the silver veins in the black marble, trying to breathe through the spike of pain in my hip. I expected a dismissal or a cold inquiry about my performance. Instead, his voice came from directly over my shoulder, low and vibrating with a frequency that made the fine hairs on my neck stand up. "In the office, Nadine. Now." I didn't argue. In this house, Jang Soo-kin's words weren't requests. They were the laws of physics. I limped toward the pool of golden light, each step a betrayal of the invisibility I had worked so hard to maintain. I felt small and frayed as I crossed the threshold into his sanctuary, a room that smelled of old paper, expensive tobacco, and the dangerous weight of secrets. He returned to his chair, his tall, athletic frame casting a shadow that seemed to stretch across the entire room. He looked every bit the tech tycoon, slicked back hair, impeccably fitted dark suit, a sharp jawline that looked carved from stone, but the intensity in his eyes belonged to the man the underworld feared. "Set the bucket down," he commanded softly. I obeyed, my hands shaking as I placed the plastic handle on the floor. I stood there, my head bowed, my eyes fixed on the white collar of my own uniform. The status imbalance felt like a physical weight. "Look at me." I raised my head slowly. His expression was restrained, a mask of executive elegance, but his brow was slightly furrowed, and his eyes were locked on my arm with a terrifying focus. He reached out, his movements deliberate and slow, giving me every chance to flinch away. He didn't grab. He merely placed his hand beneath my elbow. His touch was warm, a startling contrast to the cold air of the foyer, with a gentleness that felt more dangerous than a blow. The mottled purple-black grip marks on my dark skin were stark under the lamp. I watched his face, expecting shock or perhaps the disgust of a man seeing something broken. But Soo-kin didn't look surprised. His jaw tightened until the bone threatened to break through the skin, and a visible tremor ran through his hand, not from fear but from a controlled predatory fury. He looked like a man who had been searching for a target and had finally found it. He didn't ask if it hurt. He didn't ask who did it. He simply traced the edge of a bruise with his thumb, his gaze hardening into something lethal. At that moment, I realized the danger in the room wasn't directed at me. I was no longer a maid in his house. I was a catalyst. He wasn't just looking at an injury. He was declaring a war. The silence in the office shifted from a roar to something cold and surgical. Soo-kin didn't let go of my arm immediately. His thumb remained anchored against the edge of the bruise, a silent anchor in the storm of my panic. When he finally withdrew his hand, he didn't return to the distance of a master and servant. He stood his ground, looming over me with a presence that felt like a physical weight. "You will not be returning to your home tonight, Nadine." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I looked up, my breath hitching in my chest. "Mr. Jang, I have to. If I'm not back by midnight, Marcus will." "Marcus will do nothing," he interrupted, his voice cutting through my protest like a blade through silk. It wasn't an angry outburst. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the absolute certainty of a man who moved mountains as a hobby. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a sleek, black smartphone. He held it out to me, the screen dark and reflective. "One call," he said, his eyes boring into mine with a lethal, shimmering intensity. "Tell him the foyer took longer than expected. Tell him you are required to stay at the estate to prepare for an early morning briefing. Tell him whatever lie you need to stay safe for the next few hours." I stared at the phone, my fingers trembling so violently I was afraid I would drop it. The idea of lying to Marcus while away from the apartment felt like a death sentence. I could already hear Marcus's voice through the receiver, the low, dangerous growl that preceded the breaking of glass. "And then," Sukin continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a promise, "you will never have to lie for him again. Not tonight. Not ever." Took the phone. The weight of it felt like a weapon. Under his unwavering gaze, I made the call, my voice thin and brittle as I recited the excuse. On the other end, Marcus's sharp, suspicious questions bled through the speaker, but Sukin's presence beside me acted as a silent shield, absorbing the venom. When the call ended, Sukin signaled to a woman who had appeared silently at the door, Minji, his primary housekeeper. "Show her to the East Suite," he commanded. As I followed her, the transition felt like a fever dream. We passed through corridors of polished wood and silk wallpaper until she opened the double doors to a room that took my breath away. It was vast, draped in creams and golds, the bed alone larger than the kitchenette of my cramped apartment. The windows looked out over the sprawling moonlit grounds of the estate, a fortress of wealth and power. I stood in the center of the plush carpet, a small, black-clad figure in a room meant for royalty. I was safe, yet for the first time in years, the silence was more terrifying than the noise. Because I knew that by staying here, I hadn't just escaped Marcus. I had entered the inner sanctum of a man who made Marcus look like a child playing with fire. The silk was a cruel luxury. It felt too smooth against my skin, a mocking contrast to the jagged reality of the life I had left behind just hours ago. I lay in the center of the vast bed in the East Suite, my body trembling with a fatigue that went deeper than bone. The room was deathly still, illuminated only by the pale silver glow of the moon stretching across the plush carpet. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcus's face when I didn't walk through the door. I heard the phantom sound of the deadbolt sliding home in our cramped apartment. I was waiting for the storm, for the inevitable moment the world would collapse back into chaos. But the storm didn't come. Instead, a mile away in the shadows of the city, a different kind of order was being established. While I stared at the high, ornate ceiling, 3 dark sedans moved like ink through the narrow streets of my neighborhood. There was no shouting, no sirens, no shattered glass. There were only men with faces like stone and hands that moved with the terrifying efficiency of professional erasers. They entered the space that had been my prison with the quiet authority of those who owned the night. Back at the estate, Jang Sukin sat in his study. The golden light of his desk lamp remained the only beacon in the dark house. He wasn't working. He was waiting. He sat with his hands steepled, his dark eyes fixed on the black smartphone resting on the obsidian surface of his desk. He looked less like a tech tycoon and more like a god of ancient justice, patient and immovable. A soft chime broke the silence. The screen of the phone illuminated his sharp features, casting a cold blue light across his face. He picked it up with a slow, steady hand. The message was brief, a clinical report from a world where people were treated as assets or liabilities. "The trash has been collected." Sukin stared at the words for a long moment. He didn't smile. There was no triumph in his expression, only the grim satisfaction of a man who had corrected a structural flaw in his foundation. He set the phone down and looked toward the door, toward the wing where I lay awake. In that moment, a strange, heavy silence settled over the estate, and over my life. The hypervigilance that had kept my heart racing for years suddenly found nothing to latch onto. The air didn't vibrate with the threat of Marcus's temper. The shadows didn't hold the weight of his violence anymore. For the first time in my existence, The house went quiet. Truly eerily quiet. I didn't know yet that the silence wasn't a fluke. It was the sound of a clean slate, bought with the kind of power that didn't just protect, it obliterated. The morning sun didn't scream. It drifted through the heavy velvet curtains of the East Suite in soft golden ribs, illuminating a world that felt fundamentally altered. I woke without the usual jolt of adrenaline, my hand instinctively flying to my ribs to brace for a pain that was now a dull, manageable ache. For a heartbeat, I looked for my black maid's uniform, the polyester armor I used to disappear into the house, but the chair where I'd left it was empty. In its place stood a rolling garment rack, holding a selection of clothes that looked like they belonged in a boutique window rather than a servant's locker. There were soft cashmere sweaters in cream and charcoal, tailored trousers that felt like silk to the touch, and a long, structured wool coat. My old shoes, worn at the heels from miles of pacing marble, had been replaced by leather loafers so soft they felt like a second skin. I dressed with trembling fingers, the high-end fabric feeling heavy with a significance I wasn't ready to claim. I felt like an imposter, a girl playing dress-up in a Titan's fortress. When I finally emerged from the suite, the absence of my apron felt like the absence of a limb. I was no longer a shadow. I was visible. I found Suk-in in the breakfast conservatory, a glass-walled room that overlooked the mist-covered gardens. He didn't look up from his tablet until I was a few feet away. "Sit, Nadine," he said. It wasn't an order this time. It was an invitation. I hesitated, my eyes darting to the sideboard where the silver coffee service sat. My instinct was to reach for the pot, to pour his cup and retreat to the kitchen. I should help the staff with the morning service, Mr. Jang. The staff has been instructed that you are no longer among them, he said, setting the tablet aside. He stood up, but he didn't move to the head of the table. Instead, he pulled out the chair directly across from his own. He waited, his intense gaze fixed on me, forcing me to cross the distance. As I sat, he didn't ask me to report on the foyer's polish. He didn't mention the trash he had collected the night before. He simply watched me with a terrifyingly calm respect, treating me with the quiet deference one might show a guest of honor or a protected ally. Today, you begin to learn that your value in this house is not measured by how well you scrub the floors, but by the fact that you are under its roof. I looked at the silver fork in my hand, then up at the man who had erased my past in a single night. The status imbalance remained, but the nature of it had shifted. I was no longer his maid, but I wasn't yet his equal. I was something else, something he had chosen to keep. And as he poured a cup of coffee and handed it to me himself, I realized that being his guest was far more dangerous than being his servant. Visibility meant I was a target, and in Suk-in's world, targets were either destroyed or fiercely, bloodily defended. The transition from the quiet of the breakfast room to the cold reality of Suk-in's world happened with the suddenness of a winter frost. I had been attempting to reconcile the man who poured my coffee with the man who had erased Marcus, but the duality of his existence remained a blurred line. That line sharpened into a razor's edge later that afternoon in the grand foyer. I was standing on the second-floor gallery, my hand resting on the polished mahogany railing, when the heavy front doors were thrown open. A group of men entered, men who didn't look like tech executives. They wore leather jackets that smelled of rain and exhaust, and their voices were loud, jagged, and lacking the reverence the estate demanded. At their center was a man with a scarred brow who was shouting about a shipment intercepted in Incheon. Suk-in emerged from his study. He didn't shout back. He didn't even quicken his pace. He walked into the center of the foyer with a terrifying rhythmic calm, his dark suit buttoned, his hands loosely at his sides. The presence he projected was so absolute that the shouting man's voice faltered and then died altogether. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise had been. "You brought chaos into my home," Suk-in said. His voice was barely above a whisper, yet it seemed to vibrate through the very marble I stood upon. The man with the scarred brow began an excuse, but Suk-in moved, a blur of motion so precise it looked choreographed. In a heartbeat, he had the man by the throat, pinning him against the heavy oak door. Sukin didn't strike him. He simply held him there, his arm a rigid bar of iron. His face was inches from the interlopers, his expression restrained, yet his eyes burned with a leashed, predatory aggression that made my heart stop. It was the same intensity one had seen when he looked at my bruises, but here there was no protective instinct, only the cold, calculated intent of a man who broke things that didn't fit his order. "I do not care about the shipment," Sukin hissed, the words dripping with a quiet, lethal venom. "I care that you forgot who I am. I care that you disturbed the peace of this house." The men behind the leader stepped back, their faces pale, their bravado evaporated. They weren't looking at a tycoon. They were looking at a monster they had foolishly poked. I realized then that the safety I felt in his presence was a privilege, a localized calm in the center of a hurricane. To the rest of the world, Jang Suk-in wasn't a savior. He was the catalyst of their nightmares. As he finally released the man and watched them flee, he adjusted his cuffs with a terrifyingly steady hand, the predator once again submerged beneath the executive. He looked up toward the gallery, catching my eye, and for a fleeting second the mask slipped. He knew I had seen the dark, and he was waiting to see if I would run. The following morning, the estate returned to its state of crystalline silence, the violence of the foyer replaced by the soft ticking of a grandfather clock. I found myself drawn back to Sukin's study, a room that had become the epicenter of my shifting world. He was absent, likely attending to the fallout of the previous day's confrontation, leaving the door slightly ajar as if inviting me to witness the machinery of his life. I stepped inside, my soft leather loafers making no sound on the Persian rug. The room smelled of cedar and the lingering ghost of his sandalwood cologne. As I moved toward the massive obsidian desk, my heart caught in my throat. There, resting on the corner of the dark polished surface, sat a small chipped ceramic sparrow. It was a worthless thing, a $5 trinket I'd bought at a flea market years ago, the only item that had made my cramped apartment with Marcus feel like a home. I reached out, my fingers trembling as they brushed the cool glaze. To anyone else it was junk, but its presence here was a revelation. Sukin hadn't just collected the trash or erased a problem. He had gone into the wreckage of my past and salvaged the one piece of me that wasn't broken. He had cleared out the apartment, settled the lease, and meticulously separated my identity from the man who had tried to consume it. The weight of it hit me all at once, a physical force that stole the air from my lungs. For years, I had been a ghost haunting my own life, invisible to everyone except the man who used me as a punching bag. I had lived in a world where no one came to help, where the screams were muffled by thin walls and apathy. But Sukin had looked at me. He had seen the limp, the bruise, and the person beneath the maid's uniform, and he had decided I was worth the effort of a war. I sank into the heavy leather guest chair, my knees finally giving out. I didn't cry because I was afraid. The fear was gone, replaced by a strange, hollowed-out peace. I cried because for the first time in my life, I had been chosen. I had been plucked from the dark not because I was a servant or a victim, but because I mattered to someone with the power to move the world. The tears were hot and silent, soaking into the expensive cashmere of my new sweater. I clutched the ceramic sparrow to my chest, the jagged, chipped wing digging into my palm. It was the pain of reality returning, the overwhelming, terrifying realization that I was no longer alone. I was saved, and the debt of that salvation felt heavier and more beautiful than anything I had ever known. When the door creaked open and Sukin's shadow fell across the floor, I didn't hide my face. I looked up, letting him see the wreckage of the woman he had claimed. The fragile piece of the estate was shattered 2 weeks later by a presence that felt like grease on silk. Sukin was away at a late-night summit, and I had taken to walking the gardens to ease the lingering stiffness in my hip. I was near the stone koi pond when a shadow detached itself from the weeping willow. He was younger than Sukin, with a cruel, hungry face and a suit that was too loud for the quiet dignity of the grounds. Minho, the leader of the White Tigers, didn't walk with Sukin's authority. He walked with the swagger of a man who enjoyed causing pain. "So, this is the little bird Jang is keeping in his cage," he said, his voice a jagged rasp. He stepped into the light of a stone lantern, his eyes raking over my cashmere sweater with a sneer. "A maid. He's gone soft, wasting his strength to protect a servant who couldn't even protect herself." I felt the old coldness of fear settle in my stomach, but beneath it was something new, a spark of defiance fueled by the weight of the ceramic sparrow still sitting on the desk inside. He stepped closer, intending to loom over me to make me feel small. "Tell him Minho came by. Tell him that when the foundation is weak, the whole house falls." He laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound, and turned back toward the gate where his men waited. He thought I was just a victim, a fragile thing to be intimidated. He didn't realize that for months, I had been a ghost. Instead of retreating to the safety of the East Suite, I did what I had spent years perfecting. Became invisible. I slipped into the deep shadows of the yew hedge, my movements silent and fluid, and followed the sound of their retreating footsteps toward the perimeter wall. I pressed my back against the cold stone near the service entrance, my breath shallow and silent. Minho was speaking to his lieutenant, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "The shipment isn't the target anymore," Minho muttered. "Sukin is distracted by this girl. Tomorrow, when he goes to the Incheon docks to settle the dispute personally, we'll be waiting at the intersection of the bridge. One car to block, one to finish it. He won't even see it coming." They climbed into their dark sedans and sped away, leaving the night air smelling of sulfur and malice. I remained in the shadows for a long time, my heart thundering against my ribs. They thought I was a weakness, a soft spot in Sukin's armor. They didn't know that being a maid had taught me how to listen to the house's secrets, how to stand in a room and be completely forgotten while absorbing every word. I wasn't just a girl who had been saved. I was the one person who knew exactly where the strike was coming from. I turned and ran toward the house, my limp barely a whisper now, ready to prove that the little bird had talons of her own. The information I carried felt like a live wire, humming with a frantic energy that made the silent halls of the estate feel suddenly too small. I found Sukin in the library, the room bathed in the flickering amber glow of the fireplace. He was leaning over a map spread across a mahogany table, his brow furrowed in that familiar, sharp intensity. When I told him what I had heard, the bridge, the timing, the white tiger's intent, his expression didn't shift into fear. Instead, it hardened into something ancient and absolute. "You've done more than enough, Nadine," he said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. He walked toward me, his movements fluid and heavy with a sudden somber grace. He reached out, his hand hovering near my cheek before he withdrew it, as if afraid the violence of his world might smudge the new life he had given me. "Minho has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. This house is no longer the sanctuary I promised you. Not until the streets are cleared." He moved to a wall safe, hidden behind a row of leather-bound books, and pulled out a thick envelope and a dark blue passport. "There is a car waiting at the service entrance. It will take you to a private airfield. From there you go to Switzerland. A new name, a clean history, and enough resources to ensure you never have to look over your shoulder again." I stared at the passport, the gold foil crest mocking the fear I had lived with for years. It was the ultimate gift, the invisibility I had once prayed for, but this time it was gilded in freedom. "You're giving me an exit," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "I am giving you the life you deserved before Marcus, and before me," he replied. His eyes locked onto mine with a devastatingly pure respect. "The war coming to these gates isn't yours to fight." I looked at the passport, then back at the man who had stood between me and the darkness without a moment's hesitation. I thought of the ceramic sparrow on his desk, and the way he had poured my coffee when I was still convinced I was nothing but a ghost. "No," I said, my voice sounding steadier, deeper than I had ever heard it. I stepped toward him, closing the distance he had tried to maintain for my own sake. I took the passport and set it firmly on the table, over the map of the city he was prepared to bleed for. I've spent my whole life running, Mr. Jang. I ran from the noise in my house, and I tried to hide in the shadows of yours. I'm tired of being a ghost. I reached out, my fingers brushing the sleeve of his dark suit. You stood for me when I couldn't even stand on my own 2 feet. I'm not going to run while you stand alone. I don't want a new name. I want to be the woman who stays. The leashed aggression in his gaze flickered, replaced by a raw, startled wonder. For the first time, the status imbalance didn't feel like a chasm between us. It felt like a bridge. He didn't argue. He simply covered my hand with his own. His grip a silent, ironclad pact. I was no longer a protected guest or a rescued maid. I was choosing the shadows, but this time I was choosing them by his side. The silence that filled the study now was fundamentally different from the heavy, suffocating dread of the night we met. It was no longer the silence of a house holding its breath or a hunter waiting for a strike. It was the quiet of a kingdom that had survived its winter. The air still carried the scent of sandalwood and old books, but it was warmer now, tempered by the soft crackle of the fireplace and the steady shared rhythm of our breathing. Sukin sat in his heavy leather chair, his dark suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbows. But he wasn't alone behind the obsidian desk. I sat beside him, the fine silk of my dress pooling around the chair that had once been a place of interrogation, but was now a seat of shared power. My posture was no longer a defensive curl designed to minimize my presence. I sat with my shoulders back, my chin level, no longer bracing for a blow or a dismissal. The conflict with Minho had passed like a fever dream, violent, swift, and absolute. The bridge had been held, the white tigers dismantled, and the city's underworld had learned a lesson written in Jang Sukin's cold, surgical ink. But the true victory wasn't in the blood spilled. It was in the peace that followed. Sukin reached out, his hand steady and warm, and took my forearm. He gently turned my skin toward the golden glow of the desk lamp. The dark, mottled bruises were gone, replaced by a faint, silvered line, the ghost of a scar where the skin had split during my life as a ghost. He didn't look at it with the clinical assessment of a businessman or the pity of a savior. He touched the mark with a lingering reverence, his thumb tracing the line as if it were a sacred text. "It doesn't hurt anymore," I whispered, and for the first time, the words were entirely true. "It should never have hurt at all," he replied, his voice a low, resonant promise. He looked up from my arm, his intense gaze locking onto mine. There was no leashed aggression now, only a profound, quiet loyalty. I looked down at the desk where the ceramic sparrow still stood, no longer a piece of salvaged junk, but a monument. I realized then that I hadn't just traded one master for another. I had stepped out of the shadows and into the light of a man who saw me as his equal in the dark. I wasn't the maid who limped through his halls, and I wasn't just a girl who needed a cage for protection. As his hand closed over mine, anchoring me to the heart of his empire, I knew the transformation was complete. The house was quiet because I was home. I was the one who knew the secrets of the marble floors and the weight of the crown he had placed upon my head. I was no longer the ghost in the corridors. I was the queen of the house, and by his side, I would ensure it stayed quiet.